Welcome to another episode of the Nuclear Investing Podcast. I'm your host, Brennan Moore. Today we're talking about a hot topic, nuclear waste. We're sitting down with Rod Baltzer from Deep Isolation. We're going to talk a little bit about what we've covered in recent episodes of how nuclear waste is really more of a political issue than it is a technical issue, and disposing of that waste underground, which is what Rod's company, Deep Isolation, is working on. We're going to spend a little bit of time on the technical side, and then we're going to transition into the financial and investing side, which is the spirit of the podcast. So really excited to sit down with Rod today and talk about something that we haven't dedicated an episode to yet, and that is certainly a hot topic in the space. So welcome to the show, Rod.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, I want to frame at the beginning what I don't want to do today. I don't want to repeat. There's a lot of good material out there with you on other podcasts. So I've heard you on Rod Adams' podcast. I heard you on Green Giants podcasts. And I think that's worth listening to. What I don't want to do is repeat too much of that. I'm sorry, we'll repeat a little bit of it because it's helpful to frame. So what I want to do, we've had some discussions recently about the nuclear fuel cycle, and I want to reference a few slides that we showed the audience and get you to talk through a little bit there just to frame up the conversation. And then we'll dig in a little bit on the technical side, and then we'll transition at the end to the financial and investing side. That work?
That sounds like a plan.
Okay, so I'm going to reference the fuel cycle here and just talk at a high level going through this for those that are watching it on YouTube or Spotify. You can see on the screen the presentation. The nuclear fuel cycle, starting really with mining, milling, conversion, enrichment, getting to all the way to fuel fabrication before the fuel goes into a nuclear reactor. Now, most people think that's the end of the road, but then the next part of the process is that fuel, once it's used, has to be stored, oftentimes for 5 or 10 years, which Rod can help us better understand. And then ultimately, it can either be reprocessed, which currently isn't done in the U.S. and in most parts of the world, and lastly, what we're talking about today, it has to be disposed of. And so the options for disposing of that, Rod, which is where I will now hand this off to you to really start talking through, is shown on this next slide. The waste process. So can you just walk us through what the options are here and currently how this is done? And then we'll get into the outlook for how Deep Isolation is approaching it.
Yeah, I think this chart does a good job. It gets produced at the reactor. It sits in a pool for about 5 years or so. And then generally after that, as their pool fills up, they move it into dry cask storage, which is still outside the reactor, but that can be for 60 years or longer. And so it's just kind of this indefinite period. In fact, you see the reactor is torn down, completely decommissioned, and all that's left is the spent nuclear fuel, and the community's just kind of stuck with it. The expectation is at some point it gets transported across the U.S. to a large centralized mined repository, Yucca Mountain. But Yucca Mountain is effectively dead. And so what do? And so Deep Isolation's got technology to leverage directional drilling that got perfected out in the oil and gas industry and potentially co-locate this with power reactors. And so now you can dispose of the fuel without transporting it long distances. And you can also find other repositories that may be deeper and safer, but definitely more modular and cost effective. And we can talk about all of that.
I want to go back real quick, Rod, and talk about Yucca Mountain and also WIP. So can you frame for the audience, what's the difference in those projects, and give a little bit more context around the Yucca Mountain project and why it's essentially sitting still?
Yeah, the waste isolation pilot project out in Carlsbad, New Mexico, the WIP plant, it was really designed for defense waste. It's transuranic, so it's uranium, plutonium, other things, but it's from defense production, and it's, I'll say, lower kind of hazard activity generally than what you're going to find in spent nuclear fuel or high-level waste out of reprocessing. But it is the world's only geologic repository that's operating right now. And it was designed to be that. It qualifies under EPA regulations. Yucca Mountain, on the other hand, was designed for that spent nuclear fuel and some of the high-level waste, defense waste from that high-level waste from reprocessing. And as you noted, there's lots of political interest, I guess, around that, and it's effectively dead. It got defunded back in 2008, and nothing's really happened there since.
And nuclear waste or spent fuel falls under what jurisdiction from a regulation standpoint? I imagine there's regulations both at the federal level and at the local state level, right?
So it's generally federal, and so depending on your level of nuclear waste, low level waste can be done by states. But generally, when we talk about spent fuel and high level waste, you need to get a license through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act in the U.S. says that only the U.S. Department of Energy can do that. Um, but EPA has promulgated, the legislation out of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and other things, and then NRC is the actual license grantor through that process. So it would be a federal license for disposal of that waste. Same with transportation or storage. You have to go to NRC and get a license for those things. It is not done through the states at this point.
Okay, well, it makes a lot of sense then why people say it's a political issue and not a technical issue.
Yeah, and you think about the technology and, we drill I mean, we drilled millions of holes around the world. We know how to drill holes. We've transported thousands of shipments of nuclear waste around the world as well. We know how to do that, but that doesn't mean it's not, politically contentious and that people have hot sports opinions about it.
Yeah. Hey, Rod, I want to talk about your favorite analogy for spent fuel. I'll show again on the screen just here real quick from our previous presentation where we talked about this with Dr. Regis Matzi. Curious to know someone who lives and breathes this, what your favorite analogy is, because there's the football field analogy of taking all the waste produced from commercial power in the US and covering a football field, and it would be around 24 feet high is the data referenced here. And then there's the power consumption from an entire lifetime of an individual, net waste fitting into a 12-ounce Coke can. So I'm sure there's like a dozen other examples here. I'm curious to hear what your favorite one is.
Well, as a fan of Dr. Pepper, I kind of like the Coke can one, but would probably change the name just slightly. But yeah, I mean, I have one of those in my hands quite a bit, and just the sheer smallness of it, and realizing that could power a lifetime, it still just boggles my mind. But it's the density of uranium and the wonders of science, I guess, all combined there.
Okay, Rod. So let's talk a little bit about deep isolation. So this is you guys are really alone in this space, is that right? And essentially trying to bury waste not only a mile deep but mile horizontally. So you mentioned leveraging technology and experience from the oil and gas industry. Can you give us just a quick 1 to 2 minute overview of what deep isolation is doing and what makes it different from anything else that's happening in the space?
Yeah, deep isolation really doesn't have competition out there. There is nobody who's looking at boreholes the way we are and trying to commercialize it. But our technology really is from the oil and gas field, where they've used directional drilling and it developed the shale fields and other things. I will say we do not frack, so we don't fractionally break formations. We try to keep those formations at depth pristine because we want this to be held and isolated from the surface. But the idea is that you would drill a hole, you'd fully case that with a steel liner, you'd cement that liner into place from all the way from surface all the way to the toe of that well. And that could be horizontal, it could be vertical, it could be slanted, it could be curved around to fit your site footprint, but it's modular. And since it is modular, you don't have to excavate an entire mine repository at once. We look at the finished program, and that's the mine repository that probably comes on first. It took them over a decade just to construct that. For us, it takes about 45 days or so to drill a well. And so this is something where we could put this at a plant with the proper licensing and things, and start work fairly quickly on the first well, and then just continue that process.
Gotcha. And then how much of that mile horizontal are you actually filling up with waste? Like, is your container, are you filling the whole horizontal with your containers, or is it just one container that gets cemented into place?
No, and if you show our canister, you'll see that it's about 16 feet long, about 15 inches in diameter. It's got a lifting attachment here in the top, the shiny part. So that'll fit with nuclear equipment as well as oil and gas. We want to make sure nobody's going to drop this thing as we hand it off through the different processes. But these are 16 feet long, so we can fit quite a few of those in that horizontal. It may not be, a mile. The site may be too small for that, but we expect there's going to be at least probably about 200 of these. So when you look at a gigawatt EWR reactor for 60 years worth of fuel that gets generated, it would need about 20 boreholes with about 200 of those canisters, so 4,000 canisters total for its entire lifetime of waste.
It's a lot of holes. It's a lot and it's not a lot when you think about it. And what's the diameter of these holes? How big of holes are they?
So these are going to be about 21 inches in diameter at
Okay.
depth. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Uh,
so it's when you think about how many holes get drilled for oil and gas, this is just a drop in the bucket. So
yeah.
it's not that many, but it is something that people haven't thought a lot about. And so, yeah, 20 holes for 60 years worth of waste, probably not a big deal. You look at coal and how much fly ash they produce and how much it would take to dispose of that, and it's a lot more.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because we'll talk in a bit. I'm curious to hear how the scaling applies to advanced nuclear because I like that you framed 1 gigawatt as 20 holes because the facilities that exist in the U.S. today are more or less a gigawatt size, and there's rounding up more or less 100 of them, just for round numbers. So we have, if we were to dispose of all this waste downhole from all these facilities, you basically have 2,000 holes, 21 inch
Right.
holes, which
That's
is
right.
just, which is not a lot. To your point, it's not a lot.
Yeah. I mean, when we talk to our drilling partners, they tell us that they've drilled well over 1 million wells or participated in over 1 million wells, and you think about 2,000, and it's just not that big a deal. Particularly as we're looking at these in places that are seismically stable, out of touch with the surface and whatnot. It probably isn't the worst drilling conditions that they've seen.
Yeah. And Rod, who are a few of the top players in that space, if you can say, that are drilling actual holes?
Yeah, so we had a groundbreaking event at the end of January, and you may have seen that we had a press release from Halliburton. So they are one of our drilling suppliers. We've been working closely with them on how to design that well and the technology and things associated with the emplacement and retrieval of those canisters and other aspects with oil and gas drilling. Obviously, they're a globally recognized name with lots of experience around the globe. And so we think that'll really help leverage this as we expand globally.
Oh, you're in good hands. You're in good hands. You arguably couldn't be in better hands when it comes to experience on drilling holes. So
We're
which is great because it's often overseen, but there's a lot of sophistication in the oil and gas industry. I mean, the innovation that's occurred over the last 3 decades and the fracking revolution, whether you're a fan of that or not, but the energy that is unleashed and the innovation that's come alongside that, there's been a lot of learning. So well done picking
for
a top
sure.
tier partner in that space.
No, we're excited about it. We're excited about all of our partners, and we think we've got a world class team that can deliver this around the world, and that was the point of it. Deep isolation shouldn't start up the learning curve from scratch, but leverage those partners who have decades of experience and a lot of depth in this specialized areas.
So Rod, let's talk. You mentioned fracking, and it's relevant as we're talking about Halliburton, and this segues into. I want to draw some parallels to produced water and oil and gas because when a lot of people in the energy business think about disposal, they think of disposing of produced water, which is water that comes out of the ground alongside oil and natural gas production. And there's controversy around that because of seismicity calls in Texas and Oklahoma and over parts of the U.S. That's directly or indirectly tied to that. And then there's the element of what happens when you frack a well and where does all that fluid go and where can the oil potentially seep into the water table. So there's several topics there. Let's start with the water table. I want to give you a moment to speak to myths that might exist there because when people start thinking about waste being underground, most people think that waste is going to get my water. So, can you help debunk a little bit the myths or misunderstanding around how you guys prevent the waste from in any way seeping into the ground, and then also just the barrier that exists, the natural barrier that exists between what you're doing a mile below the surface and then where the water table sits?
Yeah, so we've done a bunch of safety calculations, and these assume that there is an aquifer beneath the surface, and we are below that aquifer when we do our disposal. And so what as I mentioned, we've got a steel casing, we've got the canister holding the waste, we've got a steel casing, we've got cement around that casing, and then the natural rock. And if you look at that rock, that's about 1 billion tons of rock on top, so there's a lot of material for that to go through. But we assume at some point that canister erodes and rusts out, the casing rusts out, waste starts to migrate, and then we assume that somebody up on surface is using that aquifer and they're watering their cattle and their gardens and they're a subsistence farmer. And so how much dose would that person get and when would that peak dose hit that person? And so we've modeled this out and in a normal situation it looks like that subsistence farmer will get his peak dose about 1.6 million years into the future. We assumed a regulatory limit of 10 millirem, which is about a chest x-ray. And so he's 1,000 times less than that. So that's about like eating a banana is the best analogy I can come up with. One a year. I have one pretty much every day with my cereal. But so that's what we're talking about for a safety case. But it is really robust, and it's just that long amount of rock that you have diffusion and advection, and it really reduces the radionuclides before they get someplace where they could be impactful.
It sounds like it's probably going to be a robot, not a subsistence farmer by the time
Yeah, what we all
there's
look like
anything to even
1.6
consider.
million. I mean, that's a long, long
Yeah.
time in the future.
Yeah. It's interesting. I want to spend a little more time on the technical side and then we'll pivot into the financial and investing lens here. I'm curious as fuels are transitioning from low enriched uranium, which all the light water reactor fleet uses low enriched uranium, as a lot of these advanced reactors are pivoting to HALEU and more advanced fuels like TRISO. Does that change at all the volume of waste? Like, is there considerably less waste with those? Is there the same amount of waste? Can you talk us through a little bit how the advanced reactors are going to be slightly different from traditionally what's seen?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, we've got storage and other things designed for the existing fleet, uh, particularly pressurized water and boiling water reactors, but really nothing for the advanced fleet. So when you look at TRISO, whether that's pellets or matrices or whatnot, molten salt, even vitrified waste out of reprocessing streams, nobody had really looked at that before. And so we've gotten a couple of grants through DOE's Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy and looked at a universal canister that could do both the legacy fleet and the new advanced reactors to try so the molten salt, the vitrified waste, store it, transport it, dispose of it in a borehole, or dispose of it in a mined repository. If you don't know what your plan is, which we don't in the US, then you can package it once and not have to repackage it. If we had to repackage everything that's already in storage in the US, it's about $20 billion, and that doesn't include the time and dose to workers and other things like that. So excellent that we're starting to think about that now. And your question's spot on. That waste is different. And some of this, TRISO can potentially be a lot more volume than a regular EWR light water reactor. And it's just because it's so robust. There's a lot of graphite on it and other things, and it makes that kind of density of that fuel a little different than legacy reactors. It depends on the, exact technology and what kind of fuel that is, but there's the potential that that volume could be greater, it could be less, and it just kind of depends on that fuel type.
Gotcha. So your canister, my next question was going to be what's proprietary about what you're doing? Because you said no one else is doing it. And the question I get to is no one else doing it because it can't yet be done, or is no one else doing it because what you're doing is proprietary and it's a bit of a, I guess, teeing up what you just said, the universal canister that deep isolation is creating, it sounds like is a proprietary piece of equipment.
It is. We've got 91 patents, and they're not
Wow.
just for our canister. Our first patent was basically if you use directional drilling to dispose of hazardous or nuclear waste, you'll trip our patent. So it's pretty broad, but we've got it from how do you characterize that site to make sure it's going to be isolated and has been out of touch with the surface, the canister design, the weld design, how to emplace and retrieve closure of that well to make sure it's a robust closure, monitoring after you close that well, and everything in between. And so there's definitely a lot of technology. One of the things we've done is look at our technology readiness levels, and NASA and the Department of Energy have some technology readiness level kind of charts and techniques that you can use. And we think we are now up to the licensing stage, basically. So we've done this at small scale and in a lab kind of environment and whatnot, and we progressed it such that we're ready basically to license this for full scale operations at this point. So we think the technology is there. It's getting through some of the regulatory matters, and then just in the U.S. particularly, what is the policy? What are we going to do? Can we get started, or are we going to be forever tied to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in Yucca Mountain?
It's going to be fascinating to see how this evolves alongside the pace of deployment because it has to. One of the points I've made is that the states, looking at the states that are trying to be pro-nuclear, is like the states that are going to lead on the deployment side are going to lead on the waste side. Like there's that's where it gets really political, not just at the federal level, but at the state level. So let's transition to the financial side.
All right, let's do it.
A little more intuitive for me. Yeah, I'm curious, who's the first customer? Like, I mean, and if there isn't one and you can't say I understand, but like just conceptually, like who actually contracts deep isolation ultimately to dispose of the waste? I want to talk about the business model next, but just at a high level, like who is ultimately the first customer or the customer base for this?
Yeah, we see our customer as radioactive waste management organizations. And so in the US, that'll be the US Department of Energy, but most countries have somebody who's responsible for that. There's typically utilities have paid into a nuclear waste fund, and there's some money or budget set aside for some of that. And we've been in contact with most of them around the world, and have started doing small consultancy kind of work for, what is their waste form, what's their geology, what's the safety, and what would borehole disposal look like for their program, and how would that be implemented. What we're seeing is, in the U.S., I've mentioned the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and it's hard to do a lot of things here. There's interest in the new advanced reactors and making sure they've got good solutions, which is great. But we see the most interest in Europe and some of the other places like that. There's actually a taxonomy in Europe that allows you to have green financing if you can have disposal operational by 2050. And the financial impacts of that are pretty significant. And
Mm.
so, lots of companies and others are looking at that, and they really see boreholes the only way you can get there. You just can't get there quick enough with a mine repository.
Yeah, I remember you referencing on another podcast, it's 70% less cost than a mine repository, more or less. They're y'all's projections.
Yeah, up to 70%. If you've got two reactors on a site, and we're co-located with advanced reactors on that site, and dispose of it without the transportation, it can be 70% cheaper.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
And
and
how does
even
it
looking at the
work?
U.S., even looking at the U.S. with such a large inventory, we think that's at least a 50% reduction in cost.
Okay. And I'm curious to frame that in terms of the full reactor cost, because you hear that the reactor, the biggest part of the cost for a reactor isn't the reactor itself, it's the financing and the labor. So I'm curious how, at least traditionally with the light water reactor fleet, if you were underwriting an AP1000 build out, which there's a few being underwritten right now, what percentage of that build out is fuel costs? And over how much time? Like, is there some fund at the very beginning of the project that gets earmarked for waste over the life of the project, or is it just part of the ongoing OpEx or so? I guess that's two questions layered into one, but the first one being, what percentage of a traditional nuclear reactor project, more or less, is allocated for waste disposal?
Yeah, I don't know that I've got a percentage for you, but I think I can add a little more clarity on some of this. So when reactors start to operate, they have to sign what's called the standard contract with the U.S. Department of Energy. And that requires them, or it used to require them, to pay into a nuclear waste fund. And so it was 1 mil per kilowatt hour. And so it was a very small amount, but generated over their lifetime, it created millions and billions of dollars. And that nuclear waste fund has now grown to about $50 billion and is just sitting, it's been reserved for disposal of that nuclear waste. But when the Department of Energy never fulfilled its promise to actually dispose of that waste, the utility sued and said, "Why should I keep paying into this fund if you haven't done anything?" And the court said, "Yeah, true." And so they stopped the waste fee. So the I don't know the percentages, but it's that kind of mil per kilowatt hour that would be the cost. So relatively cheap, at least compared to what I'm paying at my home for a kilowatt.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure over the lifetime exactly what percentage that works into.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And then just thinking about what's the time again, just going back to a baseline light water large scale light water reactor facility. How often is waste being disposed of? It's like you mentioned that over the life there's 20 holes and there's around 200 canisters per hole. So how often though is the waste actually being disposed of at that facility and is the fuel being replaced?
So nobody has ever disposed of waste anywhere in the world. For commercial spent fuel, it's never been disposed of. About every 18 months, the legacy fleet would do an outage, and they would replace some of the fuel rods in the reactor and move those to the core, and then eventually move them out to storage. But it's generally an 18-month kind of cycle as they go through that, and they do that for their lifetimes. So we've got potential to, I'll say, put it on a truck and dispose of it every 18 months, but it's just never been done. It's always just put into storage.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because I want to go to next is the business model. So I want to talk about the deep isolation business model. So my understanding there's the capex of the hole itself. So you built out this proprietary canister, and then you also have the capex of the hole, which most of which is going to Halliburton or whoever's drilling the hole itself. And beyond that, so the capex piece, it's very capex heavy on the front end. You got to drill the hole. That's to drill a hole a mile down and a mile horizontally is I won't make you give me a number, but it's probably a couple $1 million, like $1 to $3 million, depending on where you are in geology. And that's just a reference number in my mind from the oil and gas days. But it's a few $1 million, more or less. And then so you drill a hole, you have a canister. Once you start putting canisters down hole, uh, how does the OpEx work? Are you having to service in any way what's happening downhole, or essentially the CapEx on the front end is the big capital outlay, and then you put the canister down there and there's no real OpEx, and the revenue is, and sorry, I'm just like going through in my mind the CapEx, the OpEx, and the revenue so that we can spend some time here. At the revenue is essentially what you're charging for each canister to go downhole. Or is there also revenue beyond the canister going downhole? And it's like, hey, well, we're having to service this canister every year or every month or in some way. So just that a long-winded question, but like walk us through the business model of how dollars get spent and how dollars get earned for deep isolation.
It's interesting to learn how your mind's working, but good question. For us,
And correct
what
me,
we
by the
really
way, where I'm off.
Yeah, what we really see is this is I'm going to call it like a government contract, and so it's cost plus. So as we incur cost, we expect we're invoicing that back to the government. We expect we have an IP fee with our intellectual property and proprietary information and trademarks and such as we go through it. But we charge that basically monthly as we go through. So whether we're in licensing space and we're not really doing any capex, whether we're drilling that well, which is probably more expensive than traditional oil and gas because it's larger, more robust than what they typically do, and canisters and placement and such. You asked about are we going to maintain any of those canisters? So once we get everything in place, we expect we'll have to conf- confirm conformance, I guess, that we're in compliance with the license. Everything's acting as we expect. There's nothing out of line. If there was something, then we could retrieve it, but we don't expect we'll ever do that. But once we've done that, then we would permanently seal, plug, and abandon that well. And then at that point, we're still monitoring the site. Do we see any leakage or anything that's happening that's out of normal spec? But we're really not, I'll say in a maintenance mode where we're checking the canister directly. It's more the thermal heat, the radioactivity, seismic activity or something in the area that would trigger us to, look at things a little bit differently. But we're really just billing the cost back to our customer, a government entity, and disposing of this as kind of a construction project, I guess, for them.
Gotcha. So you're not having to, the cost plus allows you, you're not having to project failure rates and figure out, okay, like what's the probability that we have to spend some CapEx in year 40 or something, or some incremental capital in year 40 and then bake that into your price. It's literally if it 40 years from now, if you incur incremental expense, you just get to bill that plus a margin on top.
That's our expectation right now.
Yeah.
Never say never. Somebody may want a firm fixed price at some point, but we expect as we start this up, that's what most government organizations have been used to, and we anticipate that would be the way we'd go forward with this.
It makes a lot of sense. And it makes my next questions on margins a little simpler too, because one of the things I was trying to, and just bear with me because it's a different business model. And this is just where my brain goes from experience, but comparing this to a saltwater disposal or produced water business model and oil and gas, where you spend the CapEx on the front end and there's facilities in place, and that facility might cost $5 or $10 million, but then it's a volume business. It's for every unit of volume that goes down hole because the water goes back into the earth, and it presumably just goes back into the earth, and there's not infinite volume that you can put down hole, and it's regulated by the local regulatory body. In Texas, it's the Railroad Commission, and other states have their own regulatory bodies, but it's a volume business. So CapEx on the front end, and then there's recurring revenue depending on how much volume's going downhole. So yeah, like my mind was a little stuck because it's like, okay, the volume is capped at 200 canisters, and so like it's not really a volume business. It's more of a upfront CapEx, and then there's like some big upfront slug of revenue. But the cost plus, that makes a lot more sense now. So I appreciate you clarifying that.
Yeah, you can almost think of us as an IP company. So we
Hmm.
bring in this supply chain of ours, and then we charge a technology fee on top of that, and that's really where our margin comes in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's talk about the transaction. So Deep Isolation went through what's called an APO, an alternative public offering, over the summer in 2025, right? Can you talk us through that transaction, what it meant, what's changed since, and just give us a little bit of a rundown of that transaction?
Yeah, our customers have told us that they need two things. One is a full scale demonstration end to end, and some more regulatory guidance. And so we've been working with the International Atomic Energy Agency on cooperative research projects, and interacting with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission on a couple aspects. But we've been able to do small scale demonstrations at depth, and a full size at surface, but not full size at depth. And so we really wanted to get that done. We hadn't been able to find any kind of government grant financing, and so we decided to go out to the public markets. A company out there had done a similar transactions. We were kind of following their footsteps, but effectively, you can think of this kind of like a SPAC without a pipe, and so we brought our own pipe, I guess, into this. So there was a public shell company out there. They really didn't have activity going on. We merged into that entity and became the surviving entity. But through that, we also raised $33 million. It was oversubscribed, and so we've got new shareholders. After that transaction closed, we're in the process of registering those shares with the SEC. And so you can go out on the SEC's website and read all about us in our registration statement. We've responded to comments, and are just kind of waiting for that to be effective at this point, where we'll start, trading over the counter, and then expect at some point we would get uplisted into NASDAQ as we go through additional transactions.
Okay, gotcha. So right, the transaction was an APO, is essentially a reverse merger into a shell company. There wasn't a traditional pipe, but there was more or less a pipe done, a private investment in public equity done alongside it. And you raised did you say 33 million?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. And what's the difference fundamentally in doing that versus just raising $33 million? It's like, what's the primary advantage of saying, hey, we're going to do it this way, and then we're going to go through the period of time that it takes to get listed over the counter, and then we're going to go over the period of time it takes to get in the NASDAQ. Like, and that's probably a 3 to 5 year window, I would think, to go from this transaction to NASDAQ, and depends on growth and all that. But walk us through a little bit the advantage of going down that path versus just saying, "Hey, the investors like the business model. We're going to raise that money in the private markets, and then we're going to go public in a via SPAC or via a traditional IPO."
Yeah, this one was interesting because we saw a lot more acceptance in the public markets and with retail investors and such than we were seeing with our traditional high net worth private entities. And so this gave us an opportunity to raise funds through a different kind of a different process and hit different investors than we normally would have. And that process, from APO through completion, definitely is not going to be 3 to 5 years. We expect that we'll get that completed in 2026.
Ah, okay. To get to Nasdaq or just to get listed on
Yeah,
over the counter.
all the way to Nasdaq.
Okay.
I mean, there's definitely no certainty ever with a company, but that's our expectation. So with Nasdaq, you can either season for a year, so have end to end 10Ks, or you can do an underwritten offering for $40 million, and that would be another way to get uplisted on the Nasdaq.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. And is there any other requirement, like some minimum valuation or minimum revenue threshold? Because I've heard before of a minimum revenue threshold, or is it really just this 40 million that you just referenced on? Is that valuation or is that the capital raise has to be 40 million?
It's the capital raise has to be 40, but there's other requirements as well, but we think we'll meet all of those requirements as we go through this.
Gotcha. Awesome. So I imagine your job's changed a little bit since that transaction was closed.
I'm not sure my job's ever been very stable. It seems like
Yeah.
we've got different priorities that come up, but it's been great. It's been forward moving for sure, and we hope impactful. So it's good to see people talking about the back end. We're trying to clean up the environment and do something that nobody's ever done before, and bring some innovation into a space that really needed it.
It's fascinating stuff. And congratulations on getting that done. And I'm sure you've learned a lot in the last, well, it's been what, 6, 7 months or so, and more to come in 2026, it sounds like.
For sure. Yeah. Stay tuned to this channel. More news to come.
Awesome. Well, Rod, what does 5 years from now look like on the innovation side? I want to wrap here with just looking at the vision in the future. Is it, is the canister going to get more robust for you guys, or is it just like, hey, we have to get buy-in from the government, we have to get buy-in from the politicians, and we have to get waste being disposed of downhole in boreholes? Like, is that really what shifts fundamentally in 5 years, or is there more to do on the proprietary technology side at deep isolation as well?
Yeah, we're excited about our canister. I'm sure that will continue to evolve, but I don't think there's giant leaps left there with the canister. This full scale demonstration, we raised the money through that APO for. I think that'll be very impactful. We expect we'll have the subsurface part of that done in the next year and a half or so, and then we'll put the surface piece together. And so that's about 3 years out. And that opens up an opportunity, I think, to start signing a first disposal contract by the time we get to the end of that kind of 5 year period. So, we've got lots of opportunities. There's interest in this space, and it seems like it's a growing area. So, we're excited about what lays ahead.
Yeah, certainly excited to track and see how things evolve for you and the deep isolation team. Last question, Rod. Unrelated at all to nuclear, okay? But I'm always curious to ask successful people that they're busy and having to operate at a high caliber all the time. What's one thing that you do consistently to keep your mind and body sharp?
I'm an early morning person. I grew up on a dairy farm. I think it just got bled into me, and hitting the gym. That is the first thing I do in the morning, and I think that helps. Hopefully with the mind, but and it doesn't show on the body, but it would be much worse if I didn't hit the gym for sure.
It's hard to argue against doing it first thing. I've tried every bit from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. and it's just, man, getting it out of the way early in the morning. It's hard to beat that.
Get that heart pumping, the blood flowing, and you're on a treadmill with not a lot to do, but think about, okay, what am I going to get done today? What do I need to prioritize? What's going on here? So hopefully you're doing that with some beats that are running a pretty good high tempo.
Exactly. As someone told me recently, and this was on the work front, but like do the hardest thing first. And I listened to that, and it's been great advice because otherwise it just lingers in my mind. It's like, okay, I'm doing this thing I want to do, but I still know I have to do that thing that I don't want to do. And to me, exercise is that way. I think, okay, I'm doing the hardest thing that my body's going to physically do today first. So it's good strategy. Well, Rod, this was a lot of fun. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for the knowledge. Thanks for the education, and look forward to tracking you guys and seeing how things evolve.
Yeah, really enjoyed the discussion. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining another episode of the Nuclear Investing Podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow, and stay tuned for more interesting conversations about how to invest in nuclear energy.